They're not just like hiding from the world. They're actually out there playing the international game.
Oh, yeah.
Using nukes.
Yeah.
And like this really carefully crafted story, their narrative.
Right.
To get aid.
Yep.
To get concessions and like, play everyone against each other.
It's a strategy that this book argues really has its roots in the collapse of the Soviet Union, which had been their main benefactor.
Right.
When that aid dried up, they faced this existential choice, adapt or perish. And the famine of the 1990s, as horrific as it was from a humanitarian perspective, kind of ironically reinforced those tactics.
Because they got this flood of international aid just for doing like the bare minimum.
Exactly.
It's like the world accidentally validated their whole approach.
Precisely. And that takes us to what I think is really the heart of the North Korean system: control.
Okay.
This book goes deep into how they have built an alternate reality for their citizens. Information is tightly controlled, and every single aspect of life, from the education system to even the clothes you wear, reinforces the regime's narrative.
So paint me a picture of this like alternate reality.
Okay.
We hear about propaganda.
Sure.
We hear about the personality cults.
But like, what's it actually like for the average person living there?
Imagine a system called Songbun. Basically, your entire life is predetermined at birth. So let's say if your grandfather was a landowner before the Korean War, you are essentially locked into a lower social class, limited job prospects, restricted living options.
So it's like a caste system.
In many ways, yes.
You're stuck in this role that the government gives you.
And there's very little chance of ever breaking free. The only way to maybe improve your songbun is through some extraordinary act of loyalty to the regime.
It's like this, they put so much effort into maintaining this system.
Absolutely.
It's like they've created this giant pressure cooker, and the only way to relieve that pressure is just to conform.
And that brings us to the figure at the center of it all. Kim Il-sung, the founder of North Korea.
Right.
Now, here's where it gets really interesting. This book argues that despite being installed by the Soviets, he wasn't your typical communist leader.
Really?
Yeah. I always thought he was like hardcore communist.
Right.
Totally in line with the Soviet Union.
That's the image. Exactly. But by really digging into newly declassified Soviet documents, this book reveals a much more complex picture. It suggests that Kim Il-sung was driven primarily by this, like, fierce Korean nationalism.
So even though the Soviets helped him get into power, he didn't want to be anyone's puppet.
Exactly. And you see this pattern throughout history. Leaders adopt whatever ideology helps them grab and maintain power, even if it's not what they truly believe. And in Kim Il-sung's case, he used the language of communism to legitimize his rule, but his real goal, his true north, was to establish himself as the ultimate protector of Korea, the only one who could reunite the peninsula.
Which is why, if you think about it, North Korean propaganda always makes the United States the ultimate enemy.
Of course.
They need that external threat to justify their own control.
It's classic us versus them narrative building. And it played perfectly into Kim Il-sung's desire to create this uniquely Korean form of communism, one that he claimed was superior to both the Soviet and Chinese models.
And so that's where we get Juche, right?
There you go.
This whole self-reliance idea that's everywhere in North Korean society.
Exactly.
It's amazing how they built this ideology that, like, justifies their isolation and their economic problems.
And for decades, it seemed to work until the 1990s happened.
The famine. The Soviet Union collapses. It feels like that's when those cracks in their facade become impossible to ignore.
Absolutely. When the public distribution system, the backbone of their planned economy, crumbled, people had no choice but to fend for themselves. This led to what's often called a shadow economy, a kind of capitalism from below.
Interesting.
That challenged the regime's control in ways they could have never anticipated.
So what did this capitalism from below actually look like in North Korea? Was this like a full-blown capitalist revolution? Or something a bit more, you know...
So picture this. It's the mid-1990s. North Korean economy is in shambles. People are struggling to find just basic necessities. The government's iron grip on society is starting to loosen, not by design, but out of sheer necessity.
They just can't provide for their people.
Exactly.
That public food distribution system,
Right.
which had been like the cornerstone of their control, was falling apart.
You got it.
Yeah.
So what happens? People adapt.
Okay.
They start trading goods and services informally,
Right.
operating outside the bounds of the state-controlled economy. Markets, once banned, begin popping up across the country.
So it's like this underground economy.
Yes.
It's just sprung up practically overnight.
Out of necessity.
Fueled by necessity and this like newfound freedom, even if it's limited,
Right.
to just buy and sell.
It's a huge shift.
Did that include like contact with the outside world?
Oh, absolutely.
Because, I mean, they share a border with China.
You're exactly right. It wasn't just food and basic necessities being traded. People were exchanging foreign currency.
Wow.
Smuggling goods across the border from China.
Okay.
Even watching smuggled South Korean DVDs.
Talk about a direct line to the enemy.
I know, right?
And I bet those DVDs, it wasn't just entertainment.
No.
It was a window into a world that their government had tried so hard to keep hidden.
Imagine living in a world where you're told constantly that your neighbors are starving and miserable.
Right.
And then one day, you get your hands on a movie that shows a completely different reality. That's the power these DVDs had.
It's got to be mind-blowing for someone
absolutely.
who's only ever known
Right.
that carefully curated reality of North Korea.
Exactly.
So how did the regime react to this?
They were in a bind.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they needed to maintain strict control to ensure their survival. But on the other hand, they had this growing internal pressure for change. For access to the outside world,
Right.
for basic economic opportunity,
Yeah.
their grip on the narrative was slipping.
Which probably explains why they're acting so erratically on the international stage, right?
It makes sense, right?
It wasn't just a rationality, it's calculated.
It was a strategy.
Desperate.
They were playing a high-stakes game of survival, using their nuclear program and their willingness to stir up trouble as leverage to extract concessions and aid from the world.
What a crazy situation.
I know.
So where do we go from here? What happens when you have a regime that is built on such a rigid foundation of ideology and control,
Right.
but then you have these forces of change colliding head-on?
That is the question that honestly kept me hooked on this book.
Yeah.
It's a story that's still being written.
Right.
And to understand where it might go next, we need to look at the reign of Kim Jong-il, the son who inherited this regime on the brink. Kim Jong-il, now here's a guy who loved Western movies, especially action flicks, thrillers.
Yeah.
You'd think a leader who demonizes the West wouldn't be caught dead watching Die Hard.
Right.
But he even had this massive personal film library.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
So he's publicly saying Hollywood is evil, but then privately, he's got like all the blockbusters.
Exactly.
What's going on there?
It's one of those contradictions that really makes you question everything you thought you knew about this guy.
Right.
It's almost like he recognized the power of Western storytelling.
Okay.
Even as he condemned it.
Yeah.
Maybe he was just picking up filmmaking tips.
Maybe.
For North Korea's own propaganda machine.
Right.
There are stories about him actually sending North Korean filmmakers abroad to study Western techniques.
Wow.
But beyond that, I think his fascination with pop culture speaks to a certain pragmatism.
Okay.
Like a recognition that North Korea couldn't remain completely isolated forever.
So was he secretly open to change? Like to letting the outside world in?
It's tough to say for sure.
Yeah. But we do know that his reign happened at the same time as some major economic shifts inside North Korea.
Yeah.
That capitalism from below we talked about was really gaining momentum.
So the market economy.
Yeah.
It's like this rigid, state-controlled system smashing up against the realities of supply and demand.
You got it.
Yeah.
The regime had to loosen its grip.
Yeah.
And people seized that opportunity. Markets flourished, trade with China boomed.
Wow.
A new class of entrepreneurs emerged.
Okay.
All operating outside the old rules.
It's like they're stuck with this outdated model.
I know.
But the ground is shifting under their feet.
Precisely. And it created this constant tension, right? They try to crack down on the markets, but then they quietly back off when it was clear that those markets were the only thing keeping the economy afloat.
Sounds like they're in way over their heads trying to control these forces. They can't.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. And you see this play out in weird ways, like the currency reform of 2009.
Oh, yeah. Remind me about that.
So they decided to revalue the currency.
Okay.
Basically wiping out people's savings overnight.
Wow.
They claimed it was to fight inflation.
Right.
But many saw it as a blatant power grab.
Yeah.
And the reaction was
what happened?
intense.
Right.
There were reports of riots, even open criticism of the government.
Wow.
Unheard of, especially in Pyongyang.
Right.
They had to backpedal,
Really?
loosen market restrictions just to stabilize things.
Another example of control backfiring.
Exactly.
So a mess.
It really highlights this contradiction at the heart of their system.
Yeah.
They need the markets to function, but those markets threaten their control.
Right.
They offer people different viewpoints, economic power outside the regime's reach.
So where does this leave North Korea?
That's the question.
Yeah.
Can a regime built on such rigid ideology and control adapt to a world that is becoming increasingly interconnected?
Yep.
It's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
The book suggests that they'll likely try to muddle through, trying to balance control and change.
Okay.
But they'll keep relying on their nuclear program and that unpredictable behavior as bargaining chips on the world stage.
So more of the same? I mean, are there other possibilities? Right. Or are we stuck with this kind of dangerous balancing act?
I mean, there are a few scenarios, even if they seem remote.
Oh.
One is a gradual shift toward a more market-oriented economy.
Okay.
Kind of like China, but they keep the one-party rule.
So tight grip on power.
Right.
But a slightly looser leash on the economy.
Exactly. Yeah. But then you have the flip side, the possibility of a sudden regime collapse triggered by internal unrest, economic meltdown, or even just a power struggle within the leadership.
Right. So those are pretty dramatic.
Love what you're hearing. Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with
like
others.
A long shot, but
your support fuels the journey for more awesome content.
Been the dream for decades.
Yeah.
But the reality is, it's way more complex than just, waving a magic wand.
Right.
You're talking about merging two societies that have been isolated for over 70 years with vast economic differences.
I mean, South Korea is this global economic powerhouse.
Right.
And North Korea can barely feed its people.
Yeah.
Not to mention the cultural differences.
It's huge. It would be a monumental task.
Yeah.
But what this book argues is that the seeds of change, they've already been sown.
Okay.
The spread of information, the market economy's growth, and crucially, the experiences of North Korean refugees now living in South Korea.
The refugees, tell me more about that.
Sure.
How are they impacting things?
They've become this vital link.
Okay.
Sending information and even money back to their families in North Korea.
Okay.
Chipping away at the regime's control over the narrative.
So even with all those restrictions, those personal connections are breaking through.
It's a testament to human resilience.
Yeah.
Even in the most closed-off societies, people find ways to connect, to share information.
Right.
To challenge the status quo.
It makes you wonder if information is the key.
Right.
Like, what else could be done? What role can the outside world play?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
And it leads us to a really interesting period in the late 1990s, early 2000s, known as the Sunshine Policy.
Sunshine Policy. Okay, so what was that all about?
Imagine this South Korea, in this, really bold move, decides to engage directly with the North.
Okay.
They're providing aid.
Okay.
They encourage economic cooperation and even start facilitating family reunions.
Wow.
Hoping that all of this is going to build some trust and kind of nudge the regime toward change.
That's fascinating. But I can see how it would be controversial, too.
Oh, yeah.
Was it seen as, appeasement back then?
Totally.
Yeah.
Critics argued it just propped up the regime, gave them more resources to keep going with their nuclear program.
Yeah. Right.
This book presents a more nuanced view.
Okay.
It says, it provided some economic benefits. It led to at least limited exchanges.
Yeah. But no fundamental change.
Right. Not really.
In how the North was behaving.
It seems that way.
Okay.
Although there's another group that plays a really interesting role here.
Okay.
In bridging that divide between North and South.
Okay.
The North Korean refugees living in South Korea.
Right. You mentioned them before.
Yeah.
They've lived in both worlds.
Exactly.
Their perspective's got to be so valuable.
It's like this underground network of communication that's constantly chipping away at the regime's control over what people believe, over the narrative. They're sending information back, often at great personal risk to themselves and their families.
Yeah.
Just offering these glimpses into a different way of life.
That's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
So we've got these external pressures, international sanctions, South Korean engagement.
Right.
But then you've also got these internal pressures.
Absolutely.
From these markets popping up.
Yeah.
from information, like sneaking in.
Right.
What's it like for that wants to hold on to control?
They're desperate for it.
But the world is changing around them.
And for our listener, as you learn more about North Korea, remember this. Behind all the headlines, behind all the politics, the nuclear threats, there are real people there with their own hopes and dreams. And they have the right to determine their own destiny.
I love that.
Their story isn't over yet. It's still being written.
And maybe, just maybe, understanding how complex this all is can help us find a way forward.
I hope so.
To a better future.
Me too.
For everyone on the Korean Peninsula and really for the world.
I think that's a great place to leave it.
Love what you're hearing? Hit that subscribe button, drop a like, and share it with others. Your support fuels the journey for more awesome content.